Okay, it's time to begin. Please sit down. I'm going to stay right here. And as we reconvene, let me say I was told that we have, at last count, 144 viewers on our streaming video of this event from as far away as Chile, and they're leaving comments. So, isn't that cool? So, yeah, thanks again well, I should mention Jake Stillman, who's been he thought he was just taking on a little sound technician job. It kind of ballooned. But anyway, he's been great, and others have been great, too. And the other thing I just want to mention while it's in my mind and while people are still sitting down is that there will be DVDs available of today's program through the association office. So I know a few of you, maybe missed part of a talk or this or that, but you will eventually be able to view the entire thing. It'll take a while, obviously, but that will be available. And of course, we'll have the audio available through the Sea Ranch Association website. Okay, welcome back. It's now my pleasure to introduce Linda Jewell, who was a colleague of mine years ago at Cal when I was there. Linda Jewell is professor of landscape architecture and urban design at UC Berkeley. In both her teaching and her practice, Linda focuses on ways in which structural interventions, so, think anything, think buildings, think outdoor theaters, parking lots, whatever, can create vivid landscape experiences. She joined the Berkeley faculty in 1991 after serving as chair of Harvard's Department of Landscape Architecture, so we stole her away, that was good. Her publications and design work have won numerous awards, and she has published widely on landscape, construction, and design, as well as producing several exhibitions. Linda Jewell, welcome.
Like everyone, I have to thank Jackie and Donlin for this wonderful event and all of the fantastic people that I have met here. I'm trying to think, I marked something out here. The embarrassing thing when they asked me, and I didn't tell them, was I had only been to Sea Ranch twice, okay? But I really wanted to do this. So I decided not to let them know. Nevertheless, the Sea Ranch, along with other landscapes and writings by Larry Halprin, have had a profound impact on my career and thinking. And I did have the privilege of knowing Larry well. The other secret is that I began my academic and professional life as an architect. Okay. And Larry was one of the influences from a distance that made me consider that maybe I was better suited to be a landscape architect. Whoops. All right. I was going to start by saying that unlike others here, I am not an expert on Sea Ranch, so I had to build my talk around Larry. And like many architecture students in the late 1960s and the early 70s, a 1966 article in Progressive Architecture, with my apologies to Architecture Record, was my first introduction to Sea Ranch. Yes, like my classmates, I was taken with the new look of the sloped roofs and the iconic forms of the buildings. And we all unthinkingly repeated them in every community center and library that we did in Raleigh, North Carolina. So one public meeting in an African-American community, with apologies to you, a young man who managed it says, "But does it have to look like a barn?" But what it said to me more than anything when I saw these images was that the landscape is important. And it became important to me as an architect. The title, Ecological Architects Planning the Organic Environment, presented a new way of thinking. I read the details of how the buildings were located and shaped to address the wind, perused all those colorful maps, but the most important thing was the piece introduced me to a new name, Lawrence Halprin, who I knew nothing about until that point. And I realized that my own interests were as much about the inside-outside relationship of buildings and landscapes as they were about buildings themselves. Fortunately, I found support for my inside-outside interest as I progressed through my architectural training through Harwell Hamilton Harris, some of you know of, who became my mentor until he died in 1990. And later, in 1969, those of us that were architecture students in that period, we were hit hard by 3 books that were published. And I hear this from all. Everything was changing. And although Design with Nature eventually meant a lot to me, and certainly complexity and contradiction were important, but the one that spoke to me was the RSVP cycles. And I struggled to understand. I've always said it was like catching fireflies to try to understand what Larry was talking about when he talked about resources, scoring, value action, and performance. But I finally said I got the part that it was about a reiterative process. And it was a process that was based on observing the landscape and understanding the landscape. Whoops, did I go backwards? Oh, and there was that image. This was from RSVP cycles. And if nothing else had pulled me in, this image itself got me interested. That was probably what initially interested me in reading the RSVP cycles in more detail. So when I began to think about graduate school, since Larry wasn't teaching anywhere, I began to look around, and I ended up at Penn with the intention of actually studying both landscape architecture and architecture, but I never finished architecture. My first contact with Larry, the first time I ever met him, was when I was a student at Penn. And his sort of rousting with Ian McHarg was a well-known fact among the students. And he came to be on a review, not in my studio, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately. And we were all gathered around the door looking in, and Larry laid back, looked at all the regional maps lined up on the wall, and said, "Ian, I like your tie-dyed maps." It was 1974, after all. I didn't really get to know Larry beyond that. I took my copy of RSVP Cycles, and he signed it, and that was it. And then I first began to know him when I was chair at Harvard. He wrote me a nice note congratulating me. He would always talk to me at various events. And then when I came to Berkeley, I also had the opportunity to spend time with him, both socially and professionally. One of the best evenings was when my friend Rich Haig was in town. That's Rich right there. He once worked for Larry. I went out to dinner with Larry, Garrett Ekbo, and Larry Halprin. If that wasn't a great opportunity, you cannot imagine. It was fantastic. And Garrett, and talk about rousting, they did their rousting as well. Okay. So I began to, most of my career, I've been interested in what I call on-site insight. How landscape architects in particular spend time on the site designing as well on the site as well as in paper. And coming from architecture, I really didn't have that skill. and it took me a while to begin to develop it. And I think it's in us all, but you have to develop it. And so I began to write about that, and Larry was one of a number of people that I began to interview because I realized that most of the landmark projects that I admired, whether they were by Halperin, Haig, Tommy Church, projects built by the CCC, making decisions on the site had been an important part of the design. They were not done in isolation in the studio. And so I interviewed him for some academic articles, and then later he contacted me because he knew I had done an exhibition on outdoor theaters, which actually was with Jackie at the museum. And he wrote me and asked me, or he called me with Dee's help, could he borrow anything I had on the exhibitions that he was redesigning Stern Grove. And I spent a wonderful day in his office. I managed to keep my 12-year-old daughter engaged through the entire day. And I interviewed him about his process once again on Stern Grove. And I wrote an article, I proposed an article for Landscape Architecture magazine. At Stern Grove, it was very obvious from conception to the last stone being put in place that he was making decisions on the site as much as he was making them on paper. And that is part of the reason it's such a very, very special place. All right, so that's the piece. But back to Sea Ranch. I had to talk about Sea Ranch, okay? So I knew that the Penn Archives held all of Larry's papers. So I made a trip this summer and spent 3.5 days in the archives. What a fantastic experience. I saw many things. We've seen this many times now. What I didn't know is that it's a drawing about 6 feet long with some color on it. I couldn't photograph the 6 feet. Everything was bigger, more colorful than I ever imagined. I see Donlin nodding his head. He saw them originally, I guess. I did put together a brief chronology of Larry to keep me informed. He started coming to the area in the 1950s. He camped here, he said, in 61 and 62. He was actually retained formally. He did some schemes in the early 1963. I'll show you one. Before any of the inventory, formally was retained in the summer of 1963. Did the environmental studies with Dick Reynolds in 3 months. July through September, and by December 63, Oceanic made the final decision to purchase the site. After that, he's written about it a lot, but his formal engagement as a consultant stopped in 66, although he continued to live here, obviously, and have contacts with certain projects. Whoops. One of the first drawings, this was actually in January of 1963. So this was before there were any environmental studies. Oceanic was just considering the project. And you'll see that although there's some indication of the importance of the coastline, it is not nearly as radical approach as he eventually went with. This was initially, at that point, it was called, he referred to it as the Del Mar Ranch, which is what it was. It then became, then became the North Coast Ranch for about 6 months. And this is where they were identifying where they were going to do all the wind monitoring and take soil borings. And then there were, of course, all the wind studies. When you go to the archives, they are endless. I had no idea they would put Ian McHarg to shame in terms of the rigor of the environmental information on this site. He did maps, he did soil maps, slope maps, everything imaginable. He had his own version of tie-dyed maps. He also very initially, he started some initial ideas and sketches, or the office did. Some of these drawings are by people in his office, clearly. Still North Coast Ranch. It doesn't want to move. And of course, everyone has seen this drawing many times, replicated many times. What part of my favorite is, in here he includes, and we were all, I guess he was naive at that point about ice plant. Ice plant was seen as a good thing. We don't think that anymore. And over here, under the need to establish standards in architects and find good architects, there was a note, this will be much harder. And he continued, this drawing would reappear, and his process was actually often to add notes on it. And he would gradually add notes about what was important. One of my favorite was the Italian hill town scheme, because when he was trying to think about what this place would be, he thought about the places where he thought architecture and the landscape were what he was after. And I don't know with what rigor he was interested in this, but he drew it, and I think it's a fascinating drawing. And of course, many of you have seen these. We've moved into 1964 in the spring, where his notebooks show many of his studies for how to reorganize the landscape. And then just a comment on how he often worked. These were drawings, these were post most of the work, but they were drawings to explain what he had done. And he would work them out in the sketchbooks, then blow them up, watercolor them, and then blow them up much larger for presentations. And one of my favorite is, and throughout the notebooks, he goes on and on about the awfulness of suburbia. And I love this little drawing right here, and it's about, he didn't want a cutesy pie subdivision. And that there he wrote UGH, U-G-H. We've seen some of this before. The level of study was incredible. I've only showing you a few of these things. I had to take them with my camera, with my iPhone. Thank goodness, bless the iPhone. And here you can see things have begun to take shape here. You note here the brown are areas that did not perk well, had standing water. He was trying to work schemes around. This was the second part of phase one, I guess. And he went through multiple road alignments on those, you see here. And finally, this was the one I found that was the closest, but anyway. His studies of the roads were incredible. He did drawings, endless drawings of exactly how this road, he would always do, this is the bad way to do it, this is the way I want you to do it, kind of thing here. And I'm sorry they're not clear. Some were abandoned, obviously. I don't know where he was proposing that, but there was a little structure to hang over the landscape. These are two of my favorite. I suspect they were done by people in his office, I don't know. But the issue is the care with which every little piece of infrastructure was planned. Even right down to the drainage structures that we think of as being innovative today, he was doing them then. And then there was the model homes. When he began to work with both Esherick and Donlin et al. He also would generate schemes. This is one that I was mentioning to the Esherick crowd that I suspect came from their office rather than his, but I don't know. And in 1965, a lot of the work was focused on his own house. And these are some sketches from his site. These are those of you that were there last night. You may relate some of the movements that he was experimenting with here. And then, of course, there were the workshops. right here in his notebooks in July of 1966, he most definitely planned the workshops at that point. It's unclear to me in several points he mentioned that the first one happened in 68. I don't know if that's a failure of memory or in fact it did stop in 68. Maybe there's someone here who knows whether they started in 66 or 68, the first one here at Sea Ranch. Nevertheless, they happened, and we had all of the cavorting, semi-cladded people that we saw earlier. This was part of the draw for me, I have to say, being, from a small southern town, and I saw, the mystical California out there and everyone cavorting on the beach. That was part of the appeal of the whole RSVP cycles and Sea Ranch. This is one of my very favorite drawings in his entire book. And, like 30 years of books right here. Sea Ranch. It was done in 1965. And now I'm just going to take you through a collection of these. What surprised me was the frequency with which he drew individual plants. His horticultural background really came through. And I think it gave him insight for what a single entity means in a broader landscape, how it can change. Many of them became more abstracted over the years. As he was doing work all over the world, images of the Cove and Sea Ranch would reappear, and it was very clear he was doing, as Mitchell talked about this morning, he was using this to refresh himself, using this place, and to make abstract diagrams that eventually showed up in his projects in urban areas. This is about water movement over there. Aren't those exquisite? Okay, it was my privilege to know Larry, to have him as a part of my education. I thought maybe before I read something, some of his quotes, I wasn't going to address sort of my vision for the future. But at lunch, I decided I needed to, and that is to remind everyone here that the landscape, when you're occupying it, particularly at even the density of Sea Ranch, it needs to be designed, it needs to be managed, and it needs to be redesigned. And that includes introducing landscape artifacts. There are very few landscape artifacts in this place. A group of us sat on the edge of the asphalt out here because there is no bench. The few times I have been here and I've walked around, very few places to stop, to gather. I realize the environment is harsh, but there are days like this, and there's really no place. This is a chance for experimentation as well, because landscape improvements are relatively inexpensive. They can be changed, they can be modified. So if you want to get flamboyant here and there, do it with a bench before you start with a building. Okay. All right, I have one final, can I read one final thing from Larry? Okay. He goes on and on about the importance of Sea Ranch, but he says, perhaps the most memorable feature of all these hauntingly beautiful places that he visited were that the whole place, rather than anyone, was about the whole place rather than any one building. And that the entire place had a memorable and coherent place. For him, I think I've lost it now. Here at Sea Ranch, I tested many of my basic ideas on the importance of place as a generation of community design. It was there that I attempted to link the character of natural form to the character of built form, and to show how one can derive in it in pragmatic ways from the other, one from the other. It was there that I evolved an integration of the two aspects of design, nature and the man-made, into a synthesized, holistic combination where you experienced both. Thank you.